Mucho gusto inaugurar este coloquio. Quiero antes que nada agradecer al doctor Mario Gómez-Torrente, a Adrián Martinero, a Romina Pardón por la organización de este evento. Well, it is an honor to open this conference on colors, sounds, numbers, names, inferences, minds, and other less important topics. And it is an honor to give the floor to Professor Kripke, who will talk about colors on metaphysics of colors. It isn't the first time that he visits the institute. It is the second one. The first one was 20 years ago. And, well, we are very happy, and really it's an honor that you come to our institute. Please, Professor Kripke.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I wanted to say a couple of things. I took myself even to be asked to give this material. It is fairly old. There's very little attempt to update it. And in fact, Mario Gómez, in the volume on my work, as Gómez-Torrente, has given quite an admirable survey paper on this, on this same material, to which I have had not so much to add, and he has more on what later writers might be criticized in view of this material. Now, let me state also that I regard this as a paper on the traditional.
Maybe we can push you
Okay.
a little bit. You're closer to the microphone.
Hear very well. On the traditional primary, secondary quality distinction as it comes in Locke, and sounds are even mentioned as an example in the title of this conference, but it was supposed to include not colors, the main thing philosophers have gotten interested in it about, but also sounds, heat and cold, right? As opposed to other so-called secondary qualities.
This time?
Yes. Okay. Now, the title of this book.
Stop.
Book. Title of this talk comes from Colin McGinn's early book. Yeah, right. The Subjective View, Secondary Qualities, and Indexical Thought. As a way of illustrating the primary-secondary quality distinction, McGinn says that though there can be fool's gold, fool's red is impossible. If most people take it for red and there are no abnormal circumstances, then it is. He is, of course, opposing what I said about this issue in a footnote in naming and necessity about yellowness. I think there are other opposed authors. He mentions, I think David Armstrong is prominent, right? That is, that these are real qualities. Now, here I am talking about what may be called the Lockean or neo-Lockean dispositional theory of so-called secondary qualities, of which colors is only one example, actually, right? Okay, now, Locke is usually credited with this distinction, between primary and secondary qualities. However, he had important predecessors, namely Boyle, from whom I think he specifically got the idea, but also others such as Galileo and Descartes. And I gather some have argued that he cannot really be considered as a positionalist. I set aside interpretation issues here. Okay, so Locke, or some counterpart of his, right, had two very different types of qualities. Actually three, but let's forget the third one. Okay, very primary qualities. They are real qualities of the bodies and utterly inseparable from them. He says those are in them whether we perceive them or not. Examples are bulk, figure, number, situation, and motion or rest of their solid parts. Okay. Secondary qualities. Now, these are not real qualities, but simply powers of the bodies to produce certain sensations in us. And this comes from Locke. The power that is in any body, by reason of its insensible primary qualities, to operate after a peculiar manner on any of our senses, and thereby to produce in it the different ideas of several colors, sounds, smells, tastes, and so on. So a color is a power to produce a certain sensation. A sound, a power to produce an ordinary sensation. What did I say?
Ordinary.
Auditory, sorry. Auditory sensation, and so on. But any object that can be sensed has a power to produce a sensation in us. This does not distinguish one sensible quality from another. The main is for primary qualities, the sensation is supposed to be produced in us because the object does have that quality. In contrast, secondary qualities are simply dispositional qualities based on their effects on our perceptual system. This is due to the relation of the primary qualities to our perceptual apparatus and various conveyances, such as light, sound waves in the air, and so on. I'm not so much going to be greatly concerned with the Locke here, but with more modern dispositionalists, misspelled on it, such as McGinn, Nagel, Shoemaker, Peacock, and so on. And that, I mean, was at the time when I originally gave this paper. I don't know what has been a lot, no doubt it's been coming along. Okay, nowadays dispositionalism comes in many versions, but at least one version of the dispositional theory can be expressed in terms of subjunctive conditionals. An object is red, hot, makes a certain sound, and so on, if and only if it would look red, etc., to normal observers under normal circumstances and can be observed by normal observers under normal circumstances. This is the version that will mostly concern us today. The often neglected last cause, and can be observed by normal observers under normal circumstances, is necessary here. If it is not satisfied, then either the object in question would turn out to be of all colors and vacuously And similarly for other qualities, other cases, or perhaps of no color at all. We all know that how to treat subjunctives with absolutely impossible antecedents is a vexed question. The restriction to normal observers and normal circumstances is also clearly needed. We do indeed think that, at least exceptionally, there can be illusions of comfort, color, temperature, sound, etc., or simply failures to perceive them. For example, someone may be colorblind, or the lighting conditions may be unusual, etc. So the disposition may not always be fulfilled. Okay, one remark here. Locke does not, in fact, seem to accept the criterion as stated here. He thinks that a substance, which I take to be multicolored porphyry, has no color in the dark, and that is obvious. But of course, it would have its normal colors if observed under normal circumstances and so on. So he would regard the situation differently. I mean, unless he regards being dark as a normal circumstances or something like that, right? But I don't think most contemporaries who write this way would think that the substance loses its color in the dark. Okay, now the notion of normal circumstances and normal observers should be specified in a simple and complete way, and of course, non-trivially. An example of a trivial specification would be said to say that the conditions are normal when red things look red, or when middle C sounds like middle C, right? That is, otherwise it's abnormal. But we could do that for any perceptual quality, and so we don't regard the specification as non-trivially in that way as allowing trivial, right, conditions of normality. That is, it's normal when you're right about it. Yeah, but not normal when you're wrong. Okay. Now, the condition should be assumed to be reasonably simple. Though, since I took my title from McGinn's book, he does not even worry about what the conditions are and just mentions it in his footnotes and says, I'm not even saying that it's easy to specify them. But I think most of the philosophers who wrote this way thought that it was right, that the condition should be assumed to be reasonably simple. Otherwise, it would be implausible to think that the conditions for the dispositions are definable in this way. Note that these biconditionals, that is, the if and only if, followed by counterfactual, that's biconditionals, are supposed to be conceptual or a priori theses. Now, corollary of the a priori is that there is to be no Monday morning at the quarterbacking, at least, I don't know whether for Locke he particularly thought this was a conceptual thesis or something he got from contemporary physics, but I think a lot of the present people advocated it. I think the more recent people advocated it, thought it was obvious that this was right, right now. Now, no Monday morning quarterbacking, that is, if further thought experiment, actual empirical material, shows the failure to perceive the actual color or hear the correct sound, etc., right, is possible for reasons other than those originally given. We cannot say, oh, we forgot this. These conditions are abnormal, right? That is, they have to be specified reasonably in advance. And similarly for other secondary qualities. And I talk about this later. Okay, now, but let's start out by considering some of the arguments that have been given in support of the primary, secondary quality distinction and the dispositionalist theory. By the way, I'll just make this remark in advance. The case of dispositionalism that Mario was mostly concerned with already is not in terms of this formulation, because it's supposed to show that normal observers will disagree, right? So, and therefore, but this was the traditional thing of philosophers before this experimental work was done. Right now, so various arguments. One involves a fantasy of Martians or another race of people with a very different system of color receptors. They're supposed to have different inner experiences in response to this proposition of color stimuli that we have. But then, might not a Martian see inadvertent its color spectrum, or see grass as red, and yet have a completely efficient perceptual system? Dispositionalists explain this by saying what is normal for the Martian is not what is normal to us, whatever that may be. Perceivers are supposed to impose their own perceptual grid on the world. Now, this example comes, in fact, from McGinn's book, and McGinn says he is not necessarily implying the difference between us and the Martians is empirically undetectable. And this is good because a traditional skeptical problem is that all of us may see colors differently, right? And of course, Mario's case is a detectable difference in normal humans. So that's a different thing too. But anyway, but I think it's good. I don't think it's easy to imagine an inverted color spectrum as some dispositionalists seem to believe, but that's not really the main point. And let me leave it here. The main objection to this argument is already found in Berkeley, who apparently got the example from Malebranche. Consider a very small creature such as a mite. It will see very small objects as being much bigger in its own visual field than what we see in ours. Our ordinary objects, if it can see them at all, would look gigantic to it. Okay, for example, 1 foot may look like the breadth of the entire room to it. Everything is magnified to scale and so on. Yet no one, certainly not Locke, should think that such an example, length, size, and so on, are mere secondary qualities dependent on the perceivers. Obviously, we see things in certain ways, and we could have had different visual experiences while seeing the same thing. But that does not imply that forms of classification that are imposed in some way are not classifications that are actually true of the world. Okay, now, it has been argued, I heard this myself from one advocate, the contemporary advocate of the view, at least at the time of this talk, the original time of this talk, that while secondary qualities are supposed to be accessible only to a single sense, primary qualities are accessible to many. And this actually would seem to follow from the traditional definition, in which secondary qualities are accounted for in terms of dispositions to affect a certain sense, such as giving a color, sounding a certain way, and so on, right? Then it would appear that dispositional has no trouble explaining why they're accessible to only one sense. In fact, it would be a corollary of the view itself as in Locke, right? Okay, now, but this argument also has very little force. It's doubtful if this is even the case as a matter of fact, let alone a priori. For example, the taste of a glass of bourbon resembles its smell. And I feel that we are, tasting the same quality of the bourbon, right? On the other hand, only the sense of touch can detect mass or weight. Certainly a traditional primary quality. Now, moreover, this is added on the basis, this is something not in the original, and I don't know so much about it. Ramina, when did I put it? Okay. See, you get
blame it on me, yes.
Moreover, there are interactions between the senses. This is supposed to be really true. Some studies claim that loud noise can suppress or greatly reduce the perception of taste. Now, I don't know exactly how this affects the thesis in question, right? But it might. And speaking about what is conceptually possible, this is something I did imagine. I actually imagined it as another connection originally. Imagine that red objects characteristically gave off a certain squeak. Now, if that had been the case, we might think of redness as detectable by both sound, sight, and hearing. Now, of course, one might say that in that case, there are two correlated qualities involved, right? And that may sound that way. It depends how we might have been brought up on this case, I think, right? But if you say this, why not say that the qualities of shape and so on detectable by sight are not the same as those detectable by touch? Okay. I didn't go on to the Molyneux question here, but later. The Molyneux problem? Later, okay. All right, now, another claim by some neo-Lockeans and even Locke himself, and so on, is the following. Our sensations or impressions corresponding to primary qualities perceptually resemble the qualities of the objects. This, however, is not supposed to apply to secondary qualities. It's hard to see what this means. How is a sensation supposed to resemble or not resemble an object? Now, if resemblance is transitive, then somehow our tactile sensations of shape resemble the corresponding visual impressions. But what does this mean? Right? The famous Molyneux question comes to mind here. Imagine a congenitally blind person suddenly restored to sight after years of blindness. The question is, would she be able to immediately tell whether qualities such as shape she perceived by touch were the same as those perceived by sight now. Somewhat inconsistently with his stated view about these qualities, Locke himself favored a negative answer when he was asked. Probably common sense intuition seems to favor such a negative answer as well. But this is really an empirical question. It is hard to decide since there are very few people like this, right? However, this is one of the few updated things I've also looked at. However, someone at MIT found 5 such experimental subjects relatively recently. Okay. I don't know how many years ago it is. Okay. Recently can be for a long time for me. Like the mite like the mite in the Farklian case. And indeed, they took a while before figuring out any correlation. They took some time, and after some experience, found there was a correlation between the qualities they had perceived just by touch blindly and those that they can now see, right? Okay. Now, yet another argument is this, or this was really what was important in the back of Locke's mind, I'm sure, right? Well, it's funny that this is stuck, though. While it's in its formulation, fundamental science contains properties corresponding to primary qualities. It does not include properties corresponding to secondary qualities. Secondary qualities are all replaced by or reduced to other dispositions in terms of molecular motions, vibrations of the air. Actually, since I'm supposed to be going, I'm basing this back to Locke, I shouldn't have put in electromagnetic radiation, right? Okay, and so on, right? Okay, right? Now, concerning the conceptual or a priori thesis, notice that this idea has no force unless it can be argued conceptually or a priori that it would be quite sure from the beginning that color predicates, heat and cold, etc., could not have appeared in the most fundamental science as irreducible qualities. Primary qualities could indeed have appeared as such irreducible qualities in the most fundamental science. However, I just don't see how any mere fact about actual science provides any such forceful argument. Okay. How have I been doing in terms of time? Okay, well, actually, it's a while.
I think it's good.
It's good?
Good, yeah, okay. Okay. All right, I'm myself would not have been surprised if it turned out that any of these secondary qualities were part of, say, fundamental physical laws. I think that this view really just reflects the physics of the 17th century. Certainly, this is what influenced Locke. But in contemporary physics, we ought to be very chary of accepting such a characterization, even as a matter of empirical fact, let alone of taking into the reflection of what's a priori. First, there isn't one subject called science or even physics. There are levels of science which are more or less fundamental. Even in the case of physics, particular subfields should rise at different levels, and putting aside the further levels in chemistry, biology, and so on. different levels of physical description are appropriate to the different branches, and we probably have not reached the most fundamental level yet. Here is something recent. Stephen Weinberg doubts that a final theory will reach in this 21st century. That is, well, perhaps somebody, see, he wrote a book called Dreams of a Final Theory, but I guess he's gotten a little pessimistic. Okay, that we're really getting there, right? I agree with Hilary Putnam, this is a different point, that various levels of physics will retain their autonomous value. And as Putnam says, I didn't find the reference or try to even, one doesn't need and shouldn't use the laws of quantum mechanics to explain why a large square peg will not fit into a small round hole. And I might add here, that, say, some things like the phlogiston theory might be taught only in history of science textbooks, right? But it's not as if physics students aren't supposed to learn Newtonian physics. They are, in fact, right? Even if it's been superseded, right? Now, going on, fluid dynamics, for example, may rightly suppose a realm of uniform continuous matter, I wanted to say, even though we know otherwise, right? Moreover, thermodynamics uses the notions of heat, cold, temperature, etc., even though these are supposed to be secondary qualities. And there's nothing wrong with being told in chemistry that the color of litmus paper can be used to test for pH, acidity, etc., right? Okay. Now, on the other hand, consider current fundamental physics, or the bit I know about it, actually, which is, of course, not something final. In special relativity and quantum mechanics, it is not the case that all the traditional primary qualities are such obvious notions. In special relativity, the ordinary shape of an object can depend on what coordinate system is being taken as the reference. Perhaps the notion of ordinary shape should be replaced by a four-dimensional one in Minkowski space-time or whatever, right? Okay. Next. In quantum mechanics, traditional shape might be replaced by a complicated superposition of qualities, right? We can envisage this an example in terms of an analog to Schrödinger's cat example, where the shape of an ice cube might be capable of change spherical if a particle has been emitted. So I do not think that the distinction between traditional primary and secondary qualities could be based on some idea that only the former can appear in proper scientific explanations. Now, let's leave aside these arguments that have been given in favor of the distinction in the dispositionalist view. By analogy with naming and necessity, I'd like to consider the following two issues in the same way. I consider them there in connection with the descriptive account of proper names. As you may recall, there was first a modal issue and then an epistemic issue involving only the actual world. Right. Okay. This is the way it was done in the first two lectures. Both accounts were, of course, directed against the traditional descriptive account of proper names. Okay, now let's consider the modal issue first, but now in the present context. At least McGinn thinks that it's obvious that if the grass looked different to all of us, say red, then it would not have remained green. only our perceptual system is affected, and the grass has not changed. A possible world in which nothing happened to the grass, but rather to our perceptual system, would be described as one in which the grass would have become red. The fact that McGinn actually uses this as an objection to those of us who do not accept his subjectivist dispositionalism, and I'm one of the people who mentioned, a couple of us, right, about color, shows that there is a very strong clash of intuitions involved. It seems obvious to me that our intuitions as to how to describe such a counterfactual situation are the exact opposite. Grass would not have changed its color. It's simply our perception of it that would have changed or would have been different. I'm speaking in the modal rather than the temporal case. There also could be a temporal case, actually, similarly. Look, saying a side remark, I imagine a cartoonist trying to draw something of this possible world. He would draw, I think, green grass and then bulbs in people's heads, with red or something, right? Not red grass or something, right? Okay. Now, it's now even Nagel and Shoemaker, reviewing McGinn's book fairly sympathetically, regard this blue as implausible, and they propose modifications of his view to avoid this consequence. So for a criticism of their alternative repairs, Shoemaker's is the better one, but raises problems for whether he believes. You see Mario's paper on this subject. Okay. All right. Now, let's look at the more complicated issues about what we say concerning the actual world. Some of the examples I introduced may not be true, but even then we could still consider what we should say if they were actual. Some, however, are true, as a matter of fact. Now, at the beginning of the talk, I said that the title expressed a reaction to McGinn's criticism of what I say about the primary-secondary quality issue in naming necessity. So what did I say there? In footnote 71 of Naming Necessity, I say the yellowness is not a dispositional property. And of course I meant dispositional in the sense of contemporary neo-Lockean views. So in the same footnote, I think I say it's acknowledge that it's related to a disposition. Adopting affixes the reference view. I thought that yellowness is that manifest property of things which produces the corresponding color sensation. It has been objected, however, that perhaps there is no such property. Perhaps things of the same color have little in common in relation to the underlying science. I call this view the Goodmanian idea of color, though Goodman probably doesn't really agree with this use of this terminology. Things of the same color really have no more in common than Goodman's grew things. Right. Okay, now let's compare this case to a somewhat less controversial one of natural kind terms, What would happen if the things we thought of as gold turned out to have little in common, not even when divided into parts, as is said in the case of jade? So it seems to me that then we would probably withdraw the term, or at least would think that our original view of it was a big mistake. Now, what about the case of yellow? It seems to be very unlikely that we would withdraw the term. I'm not taking a stand on what is true scientific picture of the matter. This point seems to be so, even if a natural belief in a single underlying property were mistaken relative to some more basic scientific picture, there are various things like the blueness of the sky might, of course, have considerably different causes than the blueness of a normal physical object, but so does the appearance of the sky itself as a dome or something. And that's not really a good example. I mean, if there is a single underlying property, it would have to be reflectance properties of substances. But, I'm digressing from here. Now, notice this is not the case with temperature. Hot and cold, also Lockean secondary qualities, do not appear to be Goodmanian relative to the next scientific level underlying thermodynamics, namely statistical mechanics. Okay, now at this point, I'd like to introduce a methodological notion, that is the notion of a prejudice. I think this notion is important not to discuss these issues, but also in many other contexts. So what is a prejudice? These are beliefs we naturally have, but are not considered unrevisable. They may come into conflict with each other or with things that we discover. We wish, however, to maintain them as much as possible. They are also very influential in our reactions to cases. They have an essential semantic role. Now, not that of an analytic definition of a term or even an a priori belief, if this is taken to imply unrevisability. So let me give an example with respect to a traditional primary quality. Solidity. So Eddington claimed, now someone reading my paper said, Eddington is not really completely accurate about this, but let's suppose that he is. He's a pretty famous scientist after all. Right, okay. That a table is not really solid because there are big gaps in it. Doesn't solid simply mean free of gaps? On the other hand, Stebbing said in response, come on, this is solid, We can find what solidity is later, but this is solid. It's a paradigmatic case of solidity. Okay. So we can take both views as expressing prejudices. One is that various paradigmatic objects we call solid really are. The other is that solid means free of gaps, Eddington. So here the two prejudices have come into conflict. Suppose a true situation where that virtually all paradigmatically solid objects were composed of uniform continuous matter, no gaps. Okay, then we might well judge that a few exceptional examples which appear to be like solid tables and were indistinguishable from the ordinary ones, were in fact produced by magicians or tricksters, were not really solid. But this has turned out not to be the case, and so there is a conflict of prejudices here. Now, I don't think I mentioned this on any slide. The idea of the redness of blood, but then if you look at it under a microscope, you see that there are lots of gaps, is quite analogous to this Eddington-Stebbing case. Okay, right, and should be looked on in terms of this analogy. Right, okay, right now then, we have various, of course, that's not normal perception with the microscope. we have various prejudices about colors. One indeed is that of paradigms. The grass is green, the English pillar box is red, the newspaper turns red in acid, and so on, right? Another prejudice, often assumed to be a priori by philosophers, is the color incompatibility principle. That is, that nothing can be both red and green all over. Now, I myself don't think that it is an a priori truth, only that nothing can look red and green all over. But I am getting ahead of myself. A related prejudice we're inclined to believe concerns, to use Goodman's term, the dissectiveness of color. For example, if something is red all over, then all its ordinary parts are red, or at least it does not have ordinary parts which are definitely not red, that is, of another color. Another prejudice we have is that an ordinary opaque object must have some color, and of course I'm taking black to be a color in this sense, not the absence of color, as one is sometimes, well, one is often taught this in school, right? It's a mysterious thing, right? Okay, right. This prejudice is in some conflict with dispositionalism, since it's hard to see why this has to be so on such a view. And of course, the view denied by many philosophers, but underlying my own footnote, that paradigmatic colored objects have this color property as a manifest one, not one that simply causes a disposition in us. Before going into further issues and examples, let me make a query about the idea of normal observers under normal conditions as favored by modern dispositionalists. If something has a disposition to affect us in a certain way, well, why call the exceptional cases errors? Why not simply call them exceptional cases? I mean, that is, someone who doesn't feel pain from something as will be discussed in John Birch's paper tomorrow, right? I feel something that would hurt most of us is lucky or unlucky. I mean, unlucky, of course, but some people might think it was lucky, right? I actually say that, but not in error. So I said John Birch will mention this. Okay, right? Okay. Nor we describe error to someone who gets a nauseous reaction to a subject that wouldn't affect most of us that way. A shoe fetishist is someone who finds something sexy that would not affect most people that way. Such people have been condemned. Of course, there's more other exceptions that are even more condemned, but are not said to be an error, even if, not said, oh, bad judgment there, exactly, right, even in such cultures. All right, now, so why are the colorblind and so on said to be wrong about color judgments rather than just exceptional like these people, right? Now, let's get into some particular cases. It's not very advanced science to be told that the surface of the sun is hot, very hot. What could this mean? On a contemporary Neo-Lockean theory, one should think to be hot is to have a certain type of sensation. To get very hot is to have more and more of it. Therefore, I suppose, if we were on the surface of the sun, a normal human observer, or even close to it, say, would have to feel very hot indeed. Would he? I think the chances are that he would feel absolutely nothing. He would probably get burned to a crisp long before he got there. Even for that, and supposing he were still alive, perhaps his sensory system would be deadened and he would feel nothing. This is a problem with a situation of being near the sun is supposed to be normal or not, because remember the last clause, right? Then it would make no sense. It would be, so the sun would be both hot and cold or whatever, right? If it can't be observed under normal conditions. Okay, right? Okay. An analogous situation right here on Earth is that a sound might be so loud as to be deafening. We actually use this expression, deafening, in the case of very loud noises. Okay. Now, I don't know whether this actually happens right away. It's certainly true that prolonged exposure, say, to loud rock music and so on, is supposed to be very bad for the hearing, right? One can imagine that it might literally drive someone deaf right away. But that doesn't mean it isn't very loud. So there can be killer intensities of some felt qualities, or at any rate intensities that don't kill you, but drive you into a state in which the requisite sensory modality has been rendered unusable. Why couldn't this happen for color? Colors can have different features. They can be brighter and brighter or darker and darker. They can possess greater and greater saturation according to how much white is in them. For example, red can range from pink to complete saturated with no hint of white. We can easily imagine that the greatest degree of saturation, say brightness of a color, it's on a continuum that we all recognize would tend to kill us or drive us blind, right? Drive us blind more than right? We can see this effect somewhat when you look at some bright object looking directly at the sun. In fact, that's dangerous. You shouldn't do it, right? In normal case, right? Now, even in the absence of any theory, the idea that an object can be so intensely red that we can never see it is not at all unintelligible. Such an object would never look red to us. This is quite intelligible and clearly analogous to the other examples we described. Hume spoke of the possibility of a missing shade of blue that we happen not to see, but he admits, contrary to his general principles, that it could be imagined, right? Now, it could be, for all we can say a priori, that there is such a shade, and we can never see it because those who look at it are killed, call it killer blue. Now, perhaps one noticed that there's a missing shape of blue by mixing dyes in a continuum that fortunately has a gas, or we can imagine a missing shade, as you noted, but not actually look at anything of that shade, right, or of near shades. Perhaps some people do look at the missing shade and are killed. Now, by the way, this example, as far as I can see from my own notes, was killer blue, but it's gotten into some secondary literature affected by my example as killer yellow, perhaps because yellow was what was mentioned in my footnote.
Yeah, I think so.
What?
That's what you use in eminent necessity.
Footnote, though, I don't use any killer example, right?
No, but
okay. Right. And anyway, I guess that's perhaps fine, right? Okay. In any event, it doesn't look blue to us under normal conditions. On my view, even the famous color incompatibility principle is not really a priori. There could be an object that's both red and green all over, and somehow, because of that, drives everyone who looks at it blind or kills them. What is impossible is that something should look both red and green all over. Don't look at it, it's red and green. Remember now also Berkeley's jaundice a disease that made everything look yellow. That's not what happens with real jaundice, as I suppose we all know. Now, suppose jaundice, I don't know where you got this idea. Suppose jaundice were produced by a very infectious substance. Suppose you're in contact with the bar of the substance and got infected with jaundice. As a result, everything will look yellow to you, even under normal conditions. Or maybe to change the notion of this jaundice, not everything, just the bar. No Monday morning quarterbacking, I suppose, declaring the conditions abnormal because of the bar, something no one would have thought of in advance, right? Okay, right. The dispositionalist should regard the bar as yellow, right? However, there might be very good reasons for calling this jaundice disposing bar red. For example, suppose a color photo is taken to the scene, it would be everything else in the normal color distribution, and the bar, jaundice bar, appears red in the print, right? One can suppose the bar is made with dyes, things we normally call red, but got infected, right? Okay, right. Now, let me return to the case of heat and cold momentarily. We're already familiar with the temperature humidity index in the summer and the wind chill index in the winter. The weather broadcaster will say, though I've heard it less stated in a precise way than I used to, right? They'd say the true temperature is X, but it feels as if it is Y, right? As we would say in the summer, it isn't just the heat, it's the humidity. That kills, doesn't really kill, that's suppressive, right? I don't mean kills, right? Similarly, for the winter, the pure dispositionalist could not make the appropriate distinction between the true and apparent temperature, but of course, it is one that we all make. Now, let me talk about an issue that applies to virtually all the sensory modalities we've discussed. The principle of normal observers under normal conditions seems to imply that what is obvious to most people is what is right. Vox populi, vox Dei, right? Okay. But on the contrary, our natural intuitions are that there are exceptional people sensitive to slight things that most of us aren't aware of. I think this point is in Averill's paper about the same time as me. I think I was had looked at that paper. So, for example, imagine that a red object is mixed with whiteness, so it becomes more and more pink, and eventually looks pure white. It could be that most people perceive it as simply white, even if there's some redness in the mixture. But some people are more sensitive and still aware of the redness. This is in conflict with the usual idea of disposition. If it has this idea of normal observers under normal condition, sounds can then softer and softer and are detectable only by especially sensitive people, or there can be slight differences in pitch. Now, even if an exceptional person were immune from Barclay's jaundice, the same problem would arise. That is, the exceptional people are bad on the normal observers under normal conditions theory, whereas in fact, they are better, more sensitive, right? One could imagine people whose range of sounds that they can hear even in pitch is better, or color, see. I mean, that is, I guess some animals do. There's a dog whistle with higher sounds. Whatever, one could imagine this with colors. Okay, in all these cases and many others, there can be good reasons for respecting the judgment of the exceptional procedures. So this poorly accords with standard dispositional theory. It fits well in a methodology in which these are detectable qualities out there. Now, let's consider certain types of color mixture phenomena. Take the object seen from a distance that's composed of red and green parts with no yellow parts. A mountain, for example. Under suitable conditions, ideally seen from a sufficient distance, it might look solid yellow. Same for a pointillist painting. Now, it has even been verified for me that on ordinary color television, what appears to be yellow is actually composed of red and green dots. At least television at the time when I was asking about this, it may have changed with high definition sets and so on. I don't know whether this is true today or not. Okay, what?
I think it is.
You think it is even now? Okay. Okay, so this is very striking since phenomenally, yellow seems to have nothing to do with the composition of red and green. Are these objects really yellow? Certainly the mountain, seen as yellow only from a distance, would appear not to be. What about the television screen? The makers intended viewers to see yellow. Various issues need to be separated. First, one should not rely on the intended aesthetic effect, which can influence even ordinary quality primaries. I have red, not the color red. It's misspelled here, right? I have red at the Pillars of the Parthenon and the Rockettes in New York City. A sort of dancing squad in Radio City Music Hall are of unequal heights, precisely to give the impression of equal height. Okay. Artist needs to take into account both color and geometrical effects. However, here we are concerned with how things really are, not aesthetic effects. Second, recall my view about solid objects. It turned out the most solid objects were composed of uniform, continuous matter without gaps, but only a few objects produced, trick objects produced by magicians. Repeating myself, or some objects seen only a distance look solid but contain facts, and perhaps we deny that a solid object can contain facts. But in the case of solidity, as has turned out not to be the case. I wish to consider yellow somewhat analogously. If nearly everything we call yellow were in fact composed of mixtures of red and green, relatively minute, such as the television, then perhaps these things really are yellow. However, I take it for granted that this is not the case, so that I want to say that although the color television gives the appropriate aesthetic effect of yellow, as does even the mountain seen from the distance, what one is seeing is not really yellow, but a clever mixture of red and green dots. And I said, and I already put it in the case of an object like the mountain, it seems solid from if the mountain seems solid from afar, but actually contains cavities with gaps where the air doesn't count, it will not really be solid in the dictionary sense cited by Eddington, whatever we think of ordinary tables. Similarly, if it is composed of red and green patches, it won't really be yellow. I think that would be our ordinary view, even though the thing is seen that way from the distance. Okay. Another prejudice of ours, hard to give up unless it needs to be, is that the color, like the solidity of an object, will not be changed by its state of motion relative to the observer. Thus, A rotating fan may look solid, but we know from observing it still that it actually contains gaps. For rotation, we can forget about red and green. There is an even more striking case. The so-called Bonhams disk, or Bonhams top, is actually black and white. But when we rotate it, it will appear in various colors to normal observers in normal circumstances, etc. Now,
I don't know if it's gonna work.
Romina was going to try to produce the Bonhams top illusion. Where is it?
Well, they are seeing it. You aren't.
Are you seeing any colors? I don't, yeah. No. Didn't work. But it.
Oh, I see green now. Blue. Just to have that out.
I think different observers rates disagree, though. I had it once when I gave a class on this, a very nice top where I just gave it an ordinary spin, and everyone thought it looked colored.
The last one you showed, the colors were beginning to show faintly.
Okay.
I saw it too, but I don't know. I mean,
It may just be the screen.
yeah.
Okay, now there is something, a butter-filled color. What?
Try it at home.
Abnormal circumstances.
Yeah. A Butterfield. See, that's a Monday morning quarterbacking right now. A Butterfield color encoder, which was occasionally shown but never became commercially viable, used this principle to produce color television on an old-fashioned black and white sets. And this was done a few times. The color pictures looked quite realistic, but they had an annoying flicker, so this never became commercially common. Now, another kind of standard color illusion comes from simultaneous contrast effects. Surely intuitive prejudice about color is that two samples of the very same dye, the same color, do not become different simply because of their surroundings. But in fact, this is a common phenomenon in terms of the way it looks, I would say, right? Two such things that are really identical in color can look strikingly different depending on differences in their surroundings. The simultaneous contrast effect, very frequent and difficult to avoid. It's really not in principle greatly different from some other illusions involving so-called primary qualities. Okay, here's a simultaneous contrast effect. Now, I don't remember, however, which
Well, these looks
which are the ones.
These looks different from that.
It's not looking different to me now. That's it.
But the first square looks as if were whiter than the other on the other side, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
There's a green tinge on the top because of the contamination of this cylinder. It can be appreciated from here.
Okay.
Okay, but now the famous Müller-Lyer illusion shows how two different lines of the same length can appear to be of different lengths simply because of some surroundings, as here, right? But that, of course, is a primary quality, right? Okay, now, and the color cases are now different. Okay, go on. There are other examples. Actually, I once had a book with lots of simultaneous contrast effects. Now, I hope I've given enough examples to show why I have rejected normal observers under normal circumstances. Dispositionalism. Notice that this is precisely, however, rejected by the dispositionalist cited by Mario later. Right? Now, for these reasons, as well as straight out intuition, I don't think it is shown that our national belief that these are qualities out there should be rejected for the so-called secondary qualities, or at least not in favor of the competing view that I have discussed. Is this the end? Okay. That is the end.
Vamos a escuchar la réplica de Mario Gómez-Torrente.
¿Se oye? I'll try to be brief so that there is time for questions from the audience. But I want to take just a minute to thank Saul for presenting his ideas on color and the primary secondary quality distinction at our university and at our institute. These are rich and important ideas, as one would expect from him. I attended a semester-long seminar that Saul gave on these topics many years ago. So I have an idea of the extent and depth of his thoughts on these issues, and of how much he has had to compress them for this presentation. I cannot think of any substantive criticism I could make of the ideas, which have actually helped shape my own thoughts on these issues. But the fact that Saul has had to compress his thoughts so much suggests an obvious plan for my comments. Ask him for more of his thoughts. I think Saul is right that the usual dispositionalist or subjectivist arguments that appeal to races of creatures, imaginary or real, with qualitatively different experiences from ours, are not much good. In the case of inverted perceivers, why shouldn't these be having different experiences of the same objective color properties that we humans see and talk about? In cases of animals or aliens with different perceptual partitions of the spectrum of wavelengths, say a partition in just two zones, why shouldn't these partitions be interpreted as corresponding to ranges of objective color properties that we humans just don't perceive as such ranges? However, a more or less recent dispositionalist argument is based on psychological data, suggesting that different normal humans, normal that is according to all the usual psychological tests, have qualitatively different color experiences of the same object in the same physical conditions, which also can be thought of as normal in a way. It is now common for dispositionalists and other subjectivists and error theorists also about color to point out that the same object is seen and reported, for example, as unique green, which means green without mixture of blue or yellow by some people, as yellowish green by others, so not unique green by others, and as bluish green, again, not unique green by still others. The location of unique green in the spectrum of wavelengths varies widely across the normal human population, as it's said. Recent dispositionalists ask, who among these normal humans is right? They answer, everybody. And they conclude that only dispositionalism, or some other subjectivist view, is compatible with the apparent intuition that everybody is right. Roughly, because when a normal person says, this is unique green, she is saying, this looks unique green to me, and mutatis mutandis for the others. My own suspicion is that these different people, again, partition the spectrum differently, and they see and talk about slightly different objective properties when they use unique green, the word unique green, that is. Even if in some sense the meaning of the expression unique green is the same for all of them. I wonder what Saul's thoughts are on this defense of dispositionalism, specifically with the idea that only dispositionalism is compatible with the apparent intuition that everybody is right in this experiment. This connects a bit with another issue that I want to ask Saul about, the issue of what are or could be the color properties. I seem to recall that years ago, he did not have a definite view on how these could be identified in scientific terms. In the way in which, as Saul recalled in his classic Naming and Necessity, scientists seem to identify the ordinary kind gold with the scientific kind au from au. Do you have a view about this now? There have been some proposals in the realist, objectivist literature that I suppose you might be sympathetic to, at least in broad terms. For example, the proposal that color properties, at least for opaque, non-luminous objects, have reflectance properties. Do you think these are any good? Do you suspect that we are far away from the right identification here? Or perhaps you think that the right properties will not be scientific properties, which, as far as I can tell, is something consistent with your view. I might also note in this connection that in the case of color, scientists seem to be mostly subjectivists of some kind or other. So it seems the objectivist philosopher can't expect much help from them, at least before they clear up some confusions. Lest I be scorned for accusing the scientists of confusion, let me quote just two of the contradictory statements about color in entries in the acclaimed Oxford Dictionary of Science, 6th edition. Primary color, any one of a set of 3 color lights that can be mixed together to give the sensation of white light, which implies that colors are types of lights. Another entry is on color, and this is supposed to be the sensation produced when light of different wavelengths falls on the human eye, which states that colors are types of sensations. So, nothing could be more clear an example of a contradiction. This connects in turn with other issues that I would be interested in hearing Saul's thoughts about. One is the issue of the relations between the contents of color language and the contents of color experience. As I see things, Saul is primarily interested in the contents of color language, in the reference of color words. And if I understand him correctly, his conjectured mechanism of prejudices is a kind of reference fixing mechanism, which when applied, sort of seeks out properties that could satisfy as many of our prejudices as possible. And it's almost bound to find some objective properties with this characteristic that can be the reference of color words. But philosophers of color seem to be mostly interested in the contents of color experience. Most of them take it for granted that it makes sense to speak of such things as the contents of color experience, of course, which might be denied. They use the notion of a chromatic property, which is the content of a color experience, as a notion interchangeable with the notion of a chromatic property that a color experience represents things as having. Now, some subjectivist philosophers have granted that they don't know what are the contents of color language, or even that color language might refer to objective, non-dispositional chromatic properties. And yet they have held that color experience represents objects as having subjective chromatic properties, independently of whether it also represents some objective chromatic properties or others. For example, according to them, our experience of a ripe tomato represents the tomato as having the property of looking that particular subjective shade of red to me now. This way they seek to preserve some kind of fundamental truth about dispositionalism or subjectivism about color. Again, I'd like to know your thoughts on this. And another set of issues that I'd like to hear Saul talk about, if there is time, is connected with the issue of theoretical identification I mentioned above. As many of you are aware, there have been many more or less recent attacks on the identifications assumed in the so-called Kripke-Putnam conception of natural kind terms, and on other aspects of the conception, of course, Kripke's conception and Putnam's conception are actually substantially different, but we can abstract from the difference for present purposes, I think. I'm thinking especially of what I like to call arbitrariness, objections, coming especially from the philosophers of chemistry and biology. To give an example, the Kripke-Putnam conception has it that the reference of gold is fixed in some historically implicit way as the substance of which most of these paradigms are examples, pointing to some paradigms of gold. But the critics say there is no single substance exemplified by the paradigms. There is the element au, with which both Kripke and Putnam, and apparently scientists by and large, identify gold. But there is also the isotope 197 au, which is the single naturally occurring isotope of au. There is also the single allotrope of au in standard conditions of temperature and pressure, and other things. The critics conclude that the Kripke-Putnam description doesn't fix any of these things as the referent of the ordinary gold, the ordinary expression of gold. As I understand the critics, most of them don't dispute that the Kripke-Putnam picture, strictly speaking, is a picture of reference fixing for natural kind words of ordinary language is on the right track. So they also reach some kind of error theoretic, eliminativist, broadly subjectivist conclusion about the contents of ordinary natural kind words. Now, I don't think that Saul thinks that color words are natural kind words, strictly speaking, but if I understand him correctly, he thinks they are pretty close to natural kind words. So I suppose that critics of this sort would be likely to come to this topic of color and argue on grounds of the kind I mentioned, that there is no hope of fixing the reference of ordinary color words by means of ordinary reference fixing mechanisms based on aspects of the ordinary conception of kinds of colors in this case. They will find, I'm sure, many scientific kinds exemplified by all paradigms of red things, or even by paradigms of red lights. I surmise that the light of certain wavelengths, luminosities, etc., will be the primary candidate for the referent of the expression red as a noun. What do you think, Saul? Perhaps the mechanism of prejudices is something distinctive to say here, or perhaps there is some basic flaw of the arbitrariness objections as applied even to the basic original Kripke-Putnam picture, or perhaps color properties will turn out not to be identifiable with scientific properties. Still, there will be some other kind of objective properties.
Yeah, well,
These are my comments.
I should have written something. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Would you like to answer?
Okay, well, I have a couple of comments to make, though not a lot. Okay. Yeah, if you have the online paper, that's good. Look, okay. First, I can't do much better in discussing the unique green or bluish and yellowish green thing than, and most of my information, in fact, about the relevant data comes from Mario's paper, right? But I wasn't aware of it. This is not the kind of dispositionalism attacked in my original seminar and paper, which was normal observers under normal circumstances, dispositionalism, since precisely the point is, right, that normal observers under normal conditions and in a way that no one is likely to deny here, right? Do ascribe different color properties, right? Okay, now, I can't improve much on Mario's discussion of this, which is in News, and I read it. I don't know. You say it was actually not so much longer after all this material, though I was not aware of it at the time. And
No, it's from about 6 years ago. It only got published this year, but it's from about 6 years.
Your paper.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's from about 6 years too. That's long after this material, which is pretty old. This is a different kind of dispositionalism now. Mario tries to make a case that this is like, well, he imagines a bizarre case of people who don't know they're in different time zones and talk about, I'm going to send another message to you today. And they've got pretty advanced things they can send these messages, but they don't know about that somehow, right? Right. And other things, it would have to be the case that, well, hot and cold, which in the tradition go in the secondary qualities, right, but are not so much denied. I mean, I don't think people are error theorists or whatever about it appears, right, temperature, right, error theorists or dispositionalists, right. No, that certainly was part of the traditional view, and I think even held by some people that I knew at the time. But, well, you can see if you're convinced by it was as good as I could do. Mario's discussion of this case, it is compared with, that is, there's some hidden indexical element in some of these quality discussions, like is this very hot? Is it cold already? Discussed a lot in Berkeley. I don't know if you mentioned Berkeley's kind of mind. Anyways, this room big or whatever, right? I think you mentioned that. So, no, this is somewhat surprising. These judgments will be like that, but not denying the objectivity of the color properties. Now, yeah, I want to see. Now, look, I probably did indeed intend to think that the color property of ordinary opaque objects is given by the reflections and absorption properties of wavelengths of light, right? I am not particularly scientifically up to date or educated or know whether this is right. It seems to me, as far as I know, that it can't be, even though Mario quotes the scientists as subjectivists, and maybe because of these things now, of course, one might be interested primarily in context of color experience, and well, and the experience of ripe tomato represents the tomato as looking that particular subjective shape to be read now, right? But, gosh, in that example, I actually suppose that it probably is, right? The way it is of the shape that it looks to me now, though things could be different. The metamerism examples, which I actually thought I saw in one book, show that our concept of looking, of it really being that this color, right, may not be so simple as it first appears, right? The supposed metamers I saw in the book did not work, right? Even if I held them over, right? But I think that metamers are of different colors. And it's not an example for color eliminationism or dispositionism any more than, say, heat might vary under hotness or coldness under various conditions, right? Okay, now let me go to the Kripke Putnam natural kind things where it says, Morrow says it's not really that we have the same view, but the differences can be forgotten for this purpose. Now, though Mario speaks of recent critics, and maybe criticism has come to people's minds, to the front of people's minds much more nowadays. What?
I don't have it.
You don't have the paper? Okay. Look, there's, well, I even have seen an earlier paper. I mean, it did not affect the community so much. Look, this is really an issue of the philosophy of language, right? That is, should such a term as gold refer to the scientific element based on the samples? And maybe that's the way scientists do use AU, but what about isotopes and indeed allotropes? Now, actually, I saw an even older paper, but I didn't like it as much as this one. There's a paper going back to 1983 on this issue in philosophy of language by Keith Donovan, right? You aware of this?
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
Mentions the isotope example.
The isotope example is prominent in that paper. The allotropes are not particularly mentioned, though he does actually mention diamonds as a form of the carbon substance. Now, as far as this issue is concerned, I think it's as good as the later stuff, of which I've looked at a couple of survey papers, one referred to me by Mario, but one also I looked at in mine, but could only get. Now, it's true also, I was probably too simple-minded about some of the stuff in the philosophy of biology. I didn't think even of the fact that, well, I didn't state anything about the cladistic issue of species and so on, or that some biological kinds have males and females that are very different from each other, right? But I still think with Michael Devitt, there's got to be a lot to the original view, so-called folk essentialism, but let me not worry about this complexity here, of which I do not feel an expert. But I mean, the Donlan paper, so you read it, right? So it's not so recent. 1983, there's, but it didn't.
History repeats itself.
Yeah, it didn't have its proper effect. Now, really, there are 2 points in the philosophy of language here. One is that though I talk, and maybe Putnam talks, as if my idea that these are references of natural kind terms comes simply as a corollary of my view on references of ordinary proper names. It isn't really right, though I think it is true that one can't talk of contingent identity here, but not that it follows that these are references to natural kind terms and some terms that give what Putnam calls exotic necessary truths instead of what I call a posterior or a necessary truth. I won't go into why that is, but I mean, that says, are not identities at all, like presumably tigers or mammals will be accepted by both Putnam and me as an a posteriori necessary truth or a so-called exotic necessary truth. I think all this is true, right? Now, he says that actually, probably, I mean, he talks about the case of hydrogen, perhaps more striking in terms of isotopes than gold because, as it occurs in, say, as heavy hydrogen occurs in heavy water, this is important for, nuclear reactors and bombs and so on, right? And also, though, it's found in ordinary water, right? That is heavy water with heavy hydrogen. It you wouldn't want to drink the stuff, right? So, right, and he also mentions carbon, where the isotope carbon-14 is important because of its tendency to decay, right? And that is used for dating things. Now, he says that rightly that Putnam and I would consider these all to be forms of carbon, and we do, and perhaps the scientific community does too. There's some earlier writer who talks about, say, deuterium or heavy hydrogen as being already a different substance or something like that. But that's not the conventional scientific view. These are forms of hydrogen and of carbon, right? But he says that it's probably that though Putnam and I are right in saying that even in, say, the 18th or 17th century when these things were not known, gold or whatever did refer to the scientifically acceptable term, right? And there's not a different 18th century sense or something like that, giving it a different reference or whatever, right? Nevertheless, there is some sort of flexibility not recognized by Putnam and myself. If the culture had been different, right, then maybe isotopes of a given element. He does not actually mention allotropes, except we give one example, diamonds. It's a case of carbon in that paper, right? And so I mainly thought of isotopes myself, but any rate, he says, you could imagine our culture developing differently, though even though we do base the ordinary terminology on the scientific one, right? Different isotopes might count as different substances if culture had developed differently. He says there's some accident in our own case that might have made it come out this way in our case, because the isotopes were discovered later, right? And the whole difference between atomic weight and atomic number with it, but presumably things shouldn't be discovered based on such accidents of the way things actually went. One could imagine that they were known simultaneously. Look, I think Donlan had a valid remark here that there is some flexibility here, right? Not recognized by Putnam and myself, and it could have turned out differently in terms of that kind of thing or whatever. I reread that paper in connection with this, and yeah, I thought its basic point of view pretty convincing on the issues in question, right? And unfortunately, right, I mean, it didn't have a lot of effect. I don't know when I read it. I mean, I probably, whenever I don't know. I mean, I could have published a withdrawal remark or modification, but it's not such a big withdrawal, right? And it does show some flexibility that I didn't recognize. Now, I've looked at 2 enormous survey papers, but only looked through them. I'm not really going to talk about these surveys, about the situation today with, I don't know if they even mentioned the old Donlan paper, right?
I don't remember.
Yeah.
So perhaps we
Yeah.
leave some time for questions.
Yes, okay.
¿Alguna pregunta?
I just have a question about your notion of prejudice.
Yes.
I would like to know if I understood correctly, because in the example that you gave, you said that there was a clash of prejudices between the scientist and the philosopher, no? Concerning whether the...
Well, the philosopher wrote, but the philosopher was defending the paradigm's prejudice, really, right? If this isn't solid, what is, you know, right?
But
and that is a natural prejudice, I think, right?
But in the
It's
case
not
of
the
the
scientist and the philosopher exactly, though. She did write her book with the title Philosophy and the Physicist. Eddington isn't exactly right because there are force fields or something. It's not really completely empty, but I think Eddington is right enough to make this a conflict, right? I know someone pointed out to me that no matter what Eddington says, you know, it's not really empty space. But
what I wanted to tell you is that it would seem that the conflict is not between 2 prejudices, but between one prejudice, the Philosophers one, which is defending the way in which we learn the word in ordinary conditions, the way in which a small boy will learn the word, and the definitions. The scientist is getting to the conclusion that the table is not solid because he's following
A definition, yeah.
some sort of definition. So, if I understood correctly, a prejudice is not a definition. It's not that something has to do with analyticity, but with other ways in which words of a meaning or references of words are used or connected in networks. So, would you say that it's more a clash between prejudices and definitions?
Prejudices, at least in official definitions, you see, she thinks, I don't know if philosophers thinks, but anyway, this philosopher thinks that the true definition of solid is of the consistency of things like this, right? Yeah, rather than gap-free or whatever, right? And it's gap-free enough in the ordinary, since if we could see big gaps, it would be different, right? Yeah. So I think it's something like that is my idea of a prejudice. It's not supposed to be a conflict between the science and the philosopher here. In this case, though, it was a scientist versus in fact, she wrote a book about philosophy and the physicist. I haven't read it. I don't know. I know. I haven't actually read either one, but and get it only from secondary. I mean, she also attacks James Jeans too, right? But I can't remember what's wrong with him, right? But but the two prejudices are things like this or what are solid, like a definition, like the cold case or something like that, or things which have no gaps or what are solid, right? Which you might well find in a dictionary or something like that.
Well, thank you very much, Professor.